to the responsibility to protect.
On atrocity prevention.
Words kill.
All societies are potentially vulnerable.
Atrocity crimes.
Timely and appropriate action.
Welcome to Expert Voices on Atrocity Prevention by the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. I'm Jacqueline Streitfeld Hall, Research Director at the Global Center. This podcast features one-on-one conversations with practitioners from the fields of human rights, conflict prevention, and atrocity prevention. These conversations will give us a glimpse of the personal and professional side of how practitioners approach human rights protection and atrocity prevention, allowing us to explore challenges, identify best practices, and share lessons learned on how we can protect populations more effectively. In this episode, we are joined by Karen Smith, former Special Advisor of the UN Secretary General on the Responsibility to Protect. Karen currently teaches international relations at Leiden University in the Netherlands and is an honorary research associate at the University of Cape Town, South Africa, where she was an associate professor in the Department of Political Studies from 2011 to 2017. Between 2006 and 2007, she served as Secretary General of the United Nations Association of South Africa. Karen holds a PhD in International Relations from Stellenbosch University and has a research focus on non-Western contributions to international relations, as well as on the changing global order. Thank you for joining us today, Karen.
Thanks so much for having me.
Can you start by sharing with us your path to a career in international relations? Were there any specific experiences or events that dramatically shaped your worldview?
Sure, yeah. And I think there's also, part of that is what brought me to IR, but also thinking about this actually made me realize that there were instances that also brought me to maybe R2P, which I hadn't realized before. So, I mean, generally, I'm South African, so I grew up partly in South Africa, but I also grew up abroad because my dad was a diplomat. And so I think, that in itself exposed me at an early age to what one might call the international as a kind of abstract concept, and led me to develop what I would think is a lifelong fascination with it. But also being from South Africa and obviously growing up during the apartheid era and then moving abroad and being, I guess, confronted with perceptions of people from outside about South Africa, and starting to realize the role of the international community in, for example, the anti apartheid struggle, but also this interface between the domestic in South Africa and the international. I think, this led me to think about questions of what I now understand as being questions about sovereignty and really debates about what should be regarded as interference in the domestic affairs of states, which, of course, is something which is very relevant to the debates around R2P as well. And the other thing I think that was really made a huge impact on me was the fact that because I was educated in an international school, I had classmates from all over the world. And so when I subsequently heard about things like conflict in the former Yugoslavia or civil war in Sudan, I thought about these places and these conflicts that were happening, in relation to my classmates and my friends that were from there. So in that sense, these world events, were less abstract to me, and they had something of a human face. Um, and that then perhaps led me to, go and study politics in the early 1990s in South Africa. And I guess this is when I became politically conscious, I would say. And of course, this was the time of South Africa's transition to democracy. And I was very much involved in the elections and subsequently also as a researcher for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Um, but if I think about how I really got to understanding the complexities of international relations, it was really through teaching about these questions, but also teaching about South Africa's political history, um, and also thinking back about individuals that I met in the course of teaching. I met, for example, the wife of one of the so-called Craddock Four, which was an important case in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. These were four activists who had been killed by the security policemen. And speaking to the widow of one of these people and hearing her views on all kinds of questions, revenge, forgiveness, amnesty, reconciliation, this really had a huge impact on me. Um, yeah, and then just maybe briefly in terms of how my research then developed, I spent a lot of time thinking about the role of value-based foreign policy, as promoted by Nelson Mandela in South Africa, but also subsequently, how difficult this is to reconcile with other priorities and interests that the state might have. And that led me to kind of more abstract questions about the universalist potential of human rights in the context, particularly of a changing global order, with the emergence of global governance groupings that South Africa was a part of, like IPSA or the BRICS. I could go on for a very long time, but I think I'll stop there, Jackie.
That's really such a rich history of experience that led you to asking these big questions. I think a lot of time practitioners and policymakers think of academics in a frame of building their knowledge strictly from being buried in a library somewhere. And we often forget that many have personal histories or work trajectories that enrich their perspective on the world around them. And this is a perfect example of that.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think sometimes people don't recognize that. You kind of you don't always reflect on your past in this way and think about what were some of the things that I experienced or some of the things I remember and how might these things actually still impact on me, even if not in a very kind of conscious way.
How did your academic pursuits eventually lead to your appointment as UN Special Advisor on the responsibility to protect?
Well, that remains a mystery. So, I did some work on R2P. I wrote some articles on actually South Africa's position with regards to the responsibility to protect, in which I guess I would say I took a rather critical view, perhaps. So I wasn't necessarily, advocating for R2P, but trying to understand how South Africa had shifted from essentially a champion, one could say, of R2P in 2005 to becoming perhaps a bit more skeptical about the idea, which I think, is reflective of the positions of many states, not just in Africa, but from other parts of the world as well. And I think linked with my interest and my research into questions of changes in global governance and what I just mentioned earlier as well, the rise of emerging powers, regional powers, and perhaps how they were interpreting and understanding these concepts, these principles in a different way, but also what their priorities and their thinking was about global governance questions more generally. I think that is what led me to be nominated for this position. So I guess that's a bit different from some of my predecessors. People like Jennifer Welsh, perhaps, who are very much embedded in the literature on the responsibility to protect and atrocity prevention, and she is really an expert in that field. I wouldn't classify myself in that way. So perhaps I came to the position more as a kind of generalist, I would say.
How did you view the UN system and R2P before you became Special Advisor?
So I guess when I was much younger, I held a view of the UN that I think many young people share, which is a rather idealistic view. But I subsequently also taught courses about the UN. And so, I was familiar with the workings of the organization, at least in theory or in abstract, and also quite critical about its failings, which I think in large part are due to the fact that it is a huge bureaucracy, and with that come all the pathologies of big bureaucracies. And of course, I also knew, again in theory, that it was constrained very much by the influence of member states, and that the UN is certainly not above or outside of global power dynamics, however much we would maybe want it to be. And also, of course, that it's not a single issue organization. It's a very peculiar organization, and it has this very wide, broad, general mandate, and so it constantly has to balance these different priorities. And of course, that means that it sometimes gets it wrong. And so, these were my ideas, I think, about the UN. But when I joined it, and perhaps now reflecting back on the last 2.5 years, I would say that many of these perceptions were reinforced in practice. And in practice, they are, of course, even more frustrating. But at the same time, I got to interact with so many individuals who work for the UN and who are extremely dedicated to their work and to I mean, forgive the cliche, but making the world a better place, essentially. Um, and so when I think about it, you mentioned when you were reading out my bio that I was involved in the UN Association of South Africa, also when I was younger. And my views about the UN in that sense haven't changed that radically. I still believe in the importance of the organization and its values, but I'm also, I think, very much conscious of the limitations that the organization has, particularly due to the fact that it consists of member states, essentially. And then you asked about the responsibility to protect specifically as well. And I have to say that before taking up the position as special advisor, I'd really thought about it essentially in abstract academic terms. And going back to what you were saying earlier, this is sometimes what academics do, think about these things in quite abstract terms. And so it was really only when I started doing the work at the UN that I really got to grips with the real impact that this, call it a principle or a norm, could have on the lives of people, and therefore how important it was for us to protect it and to advocate for it. I will also admit that I myself had some misconceptions about it, based on perhaps an incomplete understanding of what exactly R2P was all about.
Since you hinted at this a little in your last response, I'm wondering what stands out as some of the particularly challenging moments or geopolitical obstacles that you had to navigate.
Yeah, I mean, I think one can point to particular issues, but for me, if I think about the challenges, it's kind of more a persistent challenge, which is this challenge which you will be familiar with as well, is constantly having to convince not just member states, but also parts of the UN system of the value of atrocity prevention and the responsibility to protect, especially in light of the fact that when I think of the UN, I think that its failures with regards to atrocity prevention are actually what it is judged by most people around the world. It's not all the fantastic work that the UN is doing in many, many issue areas, whether it's development and poverty alleviation or managing disease, etc. When people think about the UN, they think about where was the UN in Rwanda, or where was the UN in Srebrenica, or where is the UN in Syria, or in the DRC, or in Myanmar. And so that for me was a kind of consistent struggle and frustration to have to make that case all the time about why this is actually really important. And I think linked to that challenge is constantly having to address these pervasive misconceptions about R2P. And some of the most common ones, of course, are that it's a Western concept, or it's really all about military intervention. And this is something I would come across in conversations with representatives of member states, in the same way that you might hear these misconceptions when you speak to people outside of the UN about R2P. And I think some other challenges, I mean, you hinted out this in terms of, kind of geopolitical obstacles as well, is I think being in this position, or having been in this position, just constantly being reminded as well that the great powers remain largely untouchable. And whether this has to do with human rights more generally or atrocity prevention, the great powers can get away with things that perhaps smaller, less powerful states cannot. And I think another frustration linked to that was the fact that in the current environment, there are just fewer states that are willing to stand up and defend very publicly and very vocally human rights. And within the broader human rights agenda, of course, R2P and atrocity prevention as well. And so overall, it's an uphill battle, as is, I guess, all human rights related work. But I mean, there are also positive moments. So maybe I can, just mention a few of those as well. And one can kind of categorize these in terms of institutional advances. So when one thinks about the institutionalization of R2P at the UN, which, one can have a debate about how significant that is in terms of affecting the lives of people on the ground. But we know that these things are politically important in a system like the global multilateral system and at the UN. So if we think about the fact that there were, in the past year, there were resolutions passed on R2P in both the Human Rights Council and in the General Assembly. And also, I think there's been significant new thinking about the implementation side of R2P, particularly in the face of Security Council inaction. And I think a very interesting, pathway to thinking differently has been, what about the General Assembly? Because, of course, a lot of the criticism we hear about R2P is related to the Security Council. So the fact that when the Security Council is deadlocked, what do we do then? And even though we've seen some kind of creative innovations by the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly, there's really a lot that remains to be done. And for me, this is really important because it also addresses that criticism that a lot of states have, which is essentially a criticism, I think, about the Security Council, right? So why are these decisions being taken in the Security Council? And so there's lots of potential and many, many prospects for thinking more generally about what can the General Assembly do, and what are some of the powers of the General Assembly that have been underutilized, and where, of course, we have many more states that they can then play an active role and not be constrained by the veto power of the P5.
Thanks for sharing so candidly those ups and downs of your time as special advisor. Were there any initiatives that you were personally a part of as special advisor that you felt were particularly impactful or meaningful?
Yeah, actually, there were. So, I made it sound as though it was all just challenges, but I think in terms of advances with regards to RTP, I mentioned the institutionalization, but personally as well, for me, it was very important that I was able to write the SG's report last year, highlighting the role of women in the responsibility to protect. As this, of course, is something which had been largely missing from the discussion, especially in the UN. There, of course, have been academics who have pointed this out and who have written quite extensively about this. But it was important for me to bring that into the UN and emphasize the role of women, not just as victims of atrocity crimes, but also emphasize their role as agents in terms of the peacemaking process, but also in terms of prevention. And then perhaps the thing that I found most encouraging was meeting with young people and individuals from different parts of the world who regard the responsibility to protect as a valuable tool for their own work and who want to learn more about it and to see value in raising awareness about it and linking it to their own work. And maybe just on that point, I should also mention that something which could potentially have been a highlight in terms of reflecting how people on the ground see the value of R2P. And of course, here I'm referring to the images, really the heartbreaking images of young protesters in Myanmar. I mean, that actually turned into one of my very low points because I knew that their calls were not going to be answered and that really the international community was not going to do what they were expecting the international community to do, which was essentially come to their aid.
I'm so glad that you mentioned the report on women, peace, and security in R2P, because since R2P was adopted in 2005, the gender lens and the role of women more specifically has often been there in conversations, but it's been lacking from the implementation phase. It's one of those things that's in the background. It comes up, anytime WPS conversations come up, it's there. But it's not front and center for risk analysis or response strategies very often. Given that member states often react to these reports and to your broader work, I'm curious how you found interactions with UN member states, either individually or in more regional groupings.
Yeah, so it's a bit of a mixed bag, of course. So some of the meetings you have are with advocates of R2P, I would say, or states that going into the meeting that they are going to be generally supportive. They're going to nod when you say things. They're going to agree with you about certain issues. But within that group, of course, there's also the distinction that can be made, I think, between those who will support R2P and atrocity prevention, but then perhaps are less active in terms of implementing it or operationalizing it. So, broadly speaking, and of course, these are very, very, very broad general categories. But then, of course, there are the other groups, there are the other states that one knows you're going to be receiving a lot of criticism from them. Going into the meeting, you know that this is not going to be an easy meeting, but perhaps those are sometimes the most satisfying when you are able to reach some kind of common ground, even if it is just a recognition that, yes, of course, the work around atrocity prevention is important and it's valuable. And we recognize that states have an individual responsibility to protect, but also in most cases, all states will recognize that the international community also has this collective responsibility. So that for me was also